please click to subscribe. Really appreciate all of your support for my channel and everybody who's subscribed. I know this background's kind of weird. I'm actually in the News Nation garage. This is where we keep our cars in our office, and our neighbors actually play really loud music, but they just turn their music off, so it's not too loud right now. But this is where I actually spend a lot of time, where people haven't really seen. But I wanted to get into the latest on the Nancy Guthrie investigation. It's now been 124 days since Nancy Guthrie vanished from her home in Tucson, Arizona. More than 4 months at this point, which is kind of crazy to wrap your mind around. I remember when I said it's now been 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, now 4 months at this point. And some of you have been asking this question, like, what if they never find Nancy Guthrie? What if they never find Nancy Guthrie's remains? And coming up in this episode, I have a really, really interesting guest, and I'm gonna talk to literally the top expert on no-body homicide investigations. The question of how do you prosecute someone if you never find a body? And that actually does happen. It's not always easy. It's actually harder for prosecutors, but it does happen. And my guest is going to explain how that would work with the Nancy Guthrie case based on everything that we know so far. If she's never found, and I hate to think like that, and I obviously think of the Guthrie family and, you know, them getting closure and all of that. So hopefully it won't come to that. But if she is never found, could they still prosecute the case? He's going to explain that. And again, he's like the top expert on it. And also, this was interesting. He explains what mistake he thinks was made and is being made that will make it harder for the prosecutors when they get into court. And I'm not talking about the crime scene being cleared quickly. I know that's something that's already been brought up a lot, but there's something else that he zeroed in on that he says is going to make it difficult when this goes to court, and he's going to explain that. So super interesting guest coming up in a few minutes, a little bit later in the episode. But first, I wanted to go through a new interview Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos gave. And it was just released, at least I just saw it, a lot of people are just seeing it. But it seems that it's an interview actually from several weeks ago from a local TV affiliate that was just now posted. But every time I see a new interview with Sheriff Nanos, I always look through it very, very carefully just to see if there's any new information in it, anything that I haven't heard before that I find interesting. So that's what I did with this interview too. And I found it interesting. The sheriff specifically talked a lot about relying on labs. He kept saying that they're relying on labs plural, and that was part of the reason that this is taking so long. And he's talking about the labs obviously analyzing the DNA. And I've been told for a while that there are multiple labs involved in analyzing the DNA. And remember, there was a hair that was found in Nancy's house that I reported on. And I've also learned that it is a rootless hair, which I've told you guys before. But that comes into play now with the sheriff talking about labs, because when there is no root on a hair, it is harder to get DNA off of. When there's a root on the hair, like if you pulled your hair out and the root is still attached, there's a lot of DNA on that, and they've been able to get DNA off the root of hairs for a long time. But when there is no root and it's a rootless hair, it's harder, and it takes specialists, and there are only select labs, I'm told, around the country that can get DNA off of a rootless hair, or at least that are pros at doing it and have done it before. And it's a specialty. So that is likely what he's talking about when he says multiple labs and that it's taking a long time. Also, we know that they're attempting to do IgG, investigative genetic genealogy. That also takes time and takes multiple labs. So when he said labs plural, that is the reason why, I believe. The sheriff also said there is what he called a positive to this in terms of it taking a long time and sort of where we're at right now in the investigation. He said, quote, "People are working and doing their best to stay within those rules. No one wants to arrest the wrong person." So I think what he's trying to say is the positive in them being careful and taking their time is they don't want to arrest the wrong person. And when he said that, it made me think about the two raids that we still frankly know so little about. You guys remember I was at both of those raids early on. The first one was in Rio Rico near the border with Mexico when I got the call that something was going down in Rio Rico. raced towards the Mexican border, went way too fast. Hopefully my boss isn't watching. But got there, and you remember they had detained that guy Carlos, and there was a whole big federal search warrant that happened there. And I immediately interviewed the mom, who said, no, there's no way Carlos would be involved. But anyway, remember, he ended up being let go. And so that was someone that appears to be innocent who was detained. And he ended up being a delivery driver. So I believe that that's the reason that he was targeted in that instance. Maybe his phone or something connected him back to being near the house because of a delivery that he was doing. But that was the first raid. And then there was the second raid, which was near Nancy's house, just a couple miles away, that was after that first one. And that one I actually thought really was it, because there was so much FBI there and there were so many federal agents, and they searched the house all night long. That was the one where I ended up being very, very close within the perimeter. But that also ended up being nothing, it seems. I mean, no one will comment about them. The lawyers representing the people there say they still haven't seen the search warrant. So we don't know exactly why they were so interested in that house or that person. But again, it doesn't seem like it's connected to Nancy's disappearance based on everything I know. So I just thought that was interesting, because the sheriff's saying they're trying to do everything right now and to protect also innocent people. I think back to those two raids, which were apparently misses, which you don't see that happen very much in investigations. So apparently they're being really careful right now. Sheriff Nanos also said that, and this was a quote from his interview, DNA doesn't just lead to a suspect, it also exonerates those who are innocent, which, again, going back to the raids, I thought was interesting when you consider what happened. Both of those people were detained, and they ended up, again, it appears, having nothing to do with the Nancy Guthrie case. And they now have lawyers, too. I mean, they're obviously really upset about it being dragged into this whole thing. So I'll stay on top of all of that. I've been in touch with their lawyers. The search warrants haven't been made public, but it's something that I'm really, really interested in. So I'll stay on that. But back to today's episode, I want you to hear my conversation with Tad Diabasi. Again, such an interesting person to talk to about all of this, because he's a former federal prosecutor, expert on prosecuting no-body homicides, which could end up being the situation with Nancy Guthrie. I mean, I hope it's not, but it's possible. So listen to my conversation with him specifically. No body homicides. I mean, how important is it that they find Nancy's remains? And again, we don't know that she's passed away, but I think the
Right.
assumption at this point, based on her medical history and everything we've seen go down, is she's probably not alive. Do they need to find the body?
So what I would say is I have spent the last 20 years hopefully educating police and prosecutors on how to bring nobody murder cases to trial. That said, it is always, always better to have a body, without a doubt, because even, if you get remains, it tells you this person left these remains here. These remains are from this long ago, which is less of an issue here because we know the lapse of time is 4 months, but you may be able to tell how long ago was the body deposited here. Was it deposited 4 months ago, or was it deposited 2 months ago? So there is so much on top of how did she die? Did she die of natural causes because of her medical issues? And I don't mean that she walked away and died. I mean, someone kidnapped her and then all of a sudden she passed away. And it's like, ugh, okay, this happened. Still a crime. And so having the body gives you all of that critical information. So even though my area of expertise is when you don't have a body, I always counsel continue to look for the body, particularly, in this case, it's only been 4 months, which is not a long time to be able to find remains and things like that. So do I think this case ultimately could be tried successfully as a no-body murder case? Yes. Do I think it would be way better if they were able to find a body or remains? Absolutely. You that they really haven't been searching for remains, from what I mean, and I was out there for quite some time. They had dogs in the very beginning. They had a search plane up in the very beginning, but it seemed like once they realized that this was not just a missing person, we haven't seen any, widespread searches. We haven't, you know what I mean? We haven't seen grid searches. We haven't Yes.
seen them go out into the desert. Does that surprise you?
Yes, it does, because even given the suspected circumstances of this case, which I think without knowing exactly what happened, it seems to be a kidnapping that likely led to a homicide. But most of the time, after uh, the most common disposal area for a no body murder is in water. The second most is what I call sort of buried in the woods or left behind in the woods, even though I just mean the outdoors. There's not a lot of woods in Arizona, it's desert, but that is still a possibility. And so to me, there's two reasons why it's problematic not to do a search. One is because you overlook the opportunity to find the body, which is critical. But two, when you go to trial, you want to be able to say to the jury, here's all the searches we did. And we confirmed that there's no way that she walked away on her own. There's no way that she escaped. There's no way that she committed suicide, any of those things, because you don't know that unless you've done a very thorough search and you are able to say to the jury, we can knock out these other possibilities of things happening. And all that's left is this guy appeared on the camera the night she went missing at the time she seemed to have gone missing. And that's the only logical thing, because what happens if the guy says, yeah, I got to her house and I ended up, deciding not to do it. And I walked away. I don't know what happened to her. Maybe she was sick. Maybe she was suicidal. Maybe she came after me to see what was going on. And if you haven't done any searches or haven't done adequate searching, you're leaving open the possibility of other defenses, as opposed to using your searches, the thoroughness, the amount you've done as a shield against that defense. They can't use that defense if you said we've searched all these places and we can't find it, and therefore the only logical explanation left is she was kidnapped and he took her so far away that the body can't be recovered and we'll never find her.
That's so interesting. That's something I never thought about. I mean, I was thinking, why aren't they searching just to find her? But I never thought about how you would at least want to show that you searched extensively,
Yes.
even if you don't find anything, because that would be important to a jury.
Right, because the challenge in a no body murder case is twofold. It's one, is this person dead and not just missing? And then, of course, the second challenge is that guy we have sitting over in the defendant's chair the one who did it? But if you can't show to the jury that your person is actually dead and not just missing, then you have a particular challenge. And one of the ways to do that is to say, we made all of these searches to try and find her. And by not finding her, we make it highly unlikely that she is actually alive. And we can't tell you what happened to her, but we do know this guy appeared at her house and it appears she disappeared after that. Because can you imagine how different the case would be if they found her body a quarter of a mile away somewhere? Well, wait a second. Did she walk there? How did she get there? That is a very different case than you find her body 10 miles away or you find her body in someone's house. But if you haven't searched everywhere in the close-in area to say, we can absolutely tell you that her body is not in that location, you leave yourself as a prosecution open up to particular defenses that are harder to make when you've searched everywhere. When you have a thorough search, you can say, she didn't walk away. She had mobility issues. We searched everywhere within a 2-mile radius of her house. We know for a fact she did not walk away. She did not somehow commit suicide by walking out into the desert and doing something to herself. You've locked that out as a defense. And is that a great defense? No, but it's a defense that you have now locked out from a trial. And that is important to do, because when you have a missing persons case, there are so many suspects, right? If someone is found dead in their house, the world of suspects is pretty limited. If they're found dead in their house with no signs of a break-in, the world of suspects is very limited. But here, all we have is Nancy Guthrie lived in this house. Now she's no longer in this house. So who are the suspects? Well, everybody, right? Who knows what happened? We have this person who came to the house who's the likely suspect, but we don't actually know because we don't know where she is. So you have to spend a lot of time eliminating people and eliminating defenses.
When I was out there, and this is an interesting question for you with your work history, I saw not only state prosecutors but also federal prosecutors. They did a walkthrough of the house before it was officially turned back over to the family. What role do federal prosecutors or prosecutors in general play right now? I mean, do you think they're involved behind the scenes, even though there's been no arrest and not a lot of progress from what we can tell?
I do think they're involved because kidnapping is a federal offense, and that's the hook. It's very clear here that she was kidnapped and removed from the house. I mean, I shouldn't say very clear, but the evidence seems to be strong that she was removed from the house. And a kidnapping, by definition, is whenever you detain someone against their will. So even if you're briefly holding on to someone, it doesn't have that counts as a kidnapping. It doesn't have to be the classic, I put a rag around your mouth and I tie your hands and I transport you away. But that is a separate federal crime.
If you are watching this for the first time and you want to follow every development in cases like this one, now is the moment to hit that subscribe button and join the Case Hunt TV community, because this is exactly the kind of story that demands to be told completely, carefully, and without cutting corners. Inside that house, investigators made a discovery that would quietly become one of the most significant and most frustrating pieces of evidence in the entire case. A hair was found inside Nancy Guthrie's home. Not just any hair. A hair that did not belong to anyone in the Guthrie family. A hair that had come from someone else. Someone who, according to the evidence, had been inside Nancy's home. That single strand of hair would eventually become a window into the enormous scientific challenge at the heart of this investigation, because this hair had no root. When a hair is pulled from the scalp with the follicle root still attached, DNA extraction is relatively routine. Forensic labs have been doing it successfully for decades. The root contains living cellular material that carries an abundance of genetic information. But when a hair breaks off naturally, when it falls or sheds without the root, what remains is what forensic scientists call a rootless hair. And a rootless hair is an entirely different challenge. Only a select number of specialized laboratories across the country have the equipment, expertise, and track record to successfully extract usable DNA from a rootless hair. It requires advanced mitochondrial DNA analysis techniques, specialized protocols, and analysts with specific training in low copy number DNA work. It takes time. It takes resources. And it is not guaranteed to produce a complete profile. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos, speaking in interviews that would later circulate publicly, repeatedly referenced multiple laboratories being involved in the investigation. He used the word labs, plural, consistently, and he cited those lab timelines as a primary reason for the extended duration of the investigation. His framing aligned precisely with what the forensic science suggests. When you are working with a rootless hair and attempting to extract actionable DNA from it, you do not send it to one lab and wait for a quick answer. You send it to multiple specialized facilities. You layer the analysis. You pursue every available technique, and then you wait. Beyond standard DNA extraction, investigators are reported to be pursuing what is known as investigative genetic genealogy, a methodology that became famous when it was used to identify the Golden State Killer after decades of that case going unsolved. Investigative genetic genealogy involves uploading a DNA profile to public genealogical databases and then painstakingly tracing family trees to work backward toward a potential suspect. It is extraordinarily labor-intensive. It can take months. It requires a very specific and rare skill set, and it requires that a usable DNA profile has already been successfully extracted, which brings everything back to that rootless hair, and the laboratory is still working to analyze it. The doorbell camera footage has been undergoing its own parallel process of intensive analysis. Federal investigators are reported to have been working with specialists to enhance the video, examining it frame by frame for identifying details about the individual who appeared at Nancy's door. Facial geometry, physical dimensions, clothing, gait. Beyond what the eye can see in standard playback, analysts have reportedly been examining the metadata embedded in the video file itself, which can contain information about the precise timing, technical specifications, and potentially additional captured data not visible in ordinary viewing. This kind of video forensics has, in other cases, revealed details that cracked investigations wide open. Sheriff Nanos framed all of this painstaking work in consistent terms. He emphasized that the extended timeline was not a failure. It was, in his words, a choice to work carefully within the rules of court and within guardrails designed to protect both the integrity of the investigation and the rights of individuals who might be drawn into it. He stated directly that no one wants to arrest the wrong person. Those words carried weight, because early in this investigation, law enforcement had already confronted the painful reality of what happens when you move before the evidence is fully clear. There were 2 raids, Two dramatic law enforcement operations that moved with urgency and resolve, and both, as far as can be publicly determined, came up empty. The first took place in Rio Rico, Arizona, a community near the international border with Mexico. Federal agents descended on the location. A man named Carlos was detained. A federal search warrant was executed. For a moment, it seemed like the break everyone had been waiting for. It was not. Carlos, it emerged, was a delivery driver. The working theory among observers was that his phone data or his delivery route had placed him in proximity to Nancy's neighborhood. An intersection of data points that, when examined, turned out to be entirely innocent. For the first time, he was released, and you have not yet subscribed to this channel. He became 30 seconds right now. Person whose life was disrupted by an investigation TV. We are committed to covering cases that matter. Net, told the second care and accuracy that victims and their families deserve. Just a couple of miles from Nancy's own home. This work going. The FBI presence cases like Nancy's in front of the described by those on the scene as this video too. Agents the algorithm rewards engagement through the night, and engagement the scale of the operation suggested to those watching hear her name. This might finally be the moment of resolution. Just maybe it was someone out there finally comes forward with the answer. No public connection to Nancy's sequence of events inside the Guthrie home that night. The individuals at that location also retained by legal counsel. What has been confirmed from both operations in the public record public is this: the probable Nancy Guthrie was reported missing from her Tucson area home on January 9, 2025. Two raids. The circumstances were immediately treated as suspicious. Two groups of people who now had lawyers. The investigation had been one of the most publicly watched missing persons cases in the country without, apparently, any connection to what happened to Nancy Guthrie. Evidence came from an unexpected source, being careful, a doorbell camera about not arresting the wrong person, Nancy's home, about working when investigators reviewed the footage. They took on a different dimension when viewed through the lens of those two operations. The lesson had apparently been learned. He was wearing a distinctive sportsman-style holster positioned at the front of his body, visibly displaying 120 to 4 days. The image captured enough of how much time had elapsed to show general 4 months. The shape of the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared, general build and the period captured in the most recent investigative reporting analyzed for this documentary. Then something happened that told investigators a great deal about the person they were looking for. 4 months during which a community watched the doorbell camera. 4 months rather than which investigators were quietly aborting whatever plan he had arrived with. Almost nothing. He did something improvised. For many missing persons cases, he reached out and grabbed foliage from outside the property. Investigations take vegetation from the surrounding landscape. And used it to cover the camera at its own pace. He had not brought for a case involving an elderly woman with known health conditions who was apparently taken from her own home. He adapted in the moment with 4 months without a resolution, that single without even a publicly identified suspect, details without an arrest, without a body. It spoke to a lack of particular weight. During those 4 months, a critical question in an era when doorbell cameras and smart home security devices are more common than not, the fact that this individual arrived at a target location what if Nancy Guthrie is accounting for the very real possibility of being recorded, because that hope suggested either profound naivety had been fading or an alarming level of confidence. But what if her remains would never be identified? What if the person who took her had placed her somewhere so remote, so inaccessible, blood, or so carefully concealed distribution that she simply could not be significant? What happens to the possibility of justice? Medical and forensic professionals to answer that question fully and honestly requires understanding a very specific with a wound and very challenging area of criminal law flow. The prosecution of homicide cases where no body exists, not a small abrasion, and on that subject, that was bleeding, there is one voice that carries exceptional authority for any person. Todd DiBiase spent an elderly woman as a federal prosecutor. During that time, was found at the front of the house. What became a singular expertise. It marked the place where Nancy's life, as she had known cases without came to a violent and terrifying interruption. He has studied these cases. The pacemaker data added another layer of alarm. Cardiac devices of this kind. He has spent years educating both law enforcement and prosecutors on how to successfully bring no body murder cases to trial quickly. He is, by any reasonable measure, for those monitoring the foremost expert in the country on exactly this type of legal scenario. His assessment of the physical evidence suggested she reassuring and sobering would be severely compromised by the physical trauma. The terror. Could this case be prosecuted successfully as a no-body homicide if remains are never recovered? The combination of those factors answer is honestly, yes, and without he believes the framework of evidence toward a conclusion that nobody wanted particularly to reach. The doorbell was no ransom demand, and the presence of an unidentified individual not in the days that followed, not in the weeks and months potentially support prosecution, the phone lines that investigators had prepared for. The communication channels that finding Nancy's remains would be enormously better for any in the hope that someone will reach out with body to investigators things that no amount of witness testimony or forensic inference can replace. No one can establish cause of death. The absence of communication was itself where and when the body was deposited, and it was the worst. It can determine whether death response from law enforcement was immediate or from some other cause. The FBI deployed dozens of agents to the Tucson area. Because her known sheriff's office, which held primary jurisdiction, mobilized its own resources. Died from natural causes, even in the context of a kidnapping. Tips began arriving almost at noted explicitly from local residents, from people across the country who had seen the news coverage, and from individuals who thought they recognized something in the doorbell would still constitute a serious crime. The volume of incoming information was so large that processing it all became an operational challenge what charge could be brought. This was not an unusual problem in high-profile cases. His overall counsel on the question of searching is unambiguous. During the investigation, even for the nation's top no-body homicide expert, the correct posture is always to keep looking. A hand-drawn map that Stainer had sent to the command post, and the apparent showing where he had left one of his victims, that DiBiase voiced his most pointed concern about this investigation discovered. And this is where his analysis moves from reassuring not encrypted to genuinely troubling. When the case was fresh, buried beneath the volume of information, there was arriving at the command post at a rate that exceeded the capacity to process it. The immediate tip that could break a case open can be present, but that early activity did not develop into the kind of sustained, systematic, wide area searching that DIBiase considers essential. In the Guthrie investigation, not just for finding familiar with the case, but for building the leaks after the disappearance, investigators were still working through tips that had arrived. DIBiase explained, the FBI specific and local sheriff's office were both receiving information. In a no-body homicide prosecution, quantity of that information major challenge a prosecutor faces is proving to a jury somewhere within those thousands of tips, investigators hope, not simply a piece of information. This is not as straightforward as it might seem. That hope, defense attorneys are skilled at exploiting uncertainty turned into months. Without remains, a reward was established. Stand before a jury grew to more than $1,200,000 away, an amount that attracted significant public attention and was widely described as extraordinary for this type of case. The reasoning behind a reward of that magnitude is straightforward. These questions money is a powerful motivator, particularly when the prosecution cannot definitively answer them. The more likely it becomes that someone with knowledge of the crime, the most powerful calculate that protecting a suspect is no longer worth the financial sacrifice before they can take root. Law enforcement has long understood that criminal conspiracies tend to present evidence of systematic searches covering a person who might never come forward out of civic duty. Grid searches, sometimes aerial searches for enough K9 searches. Yet the reward, as large as it was, and demonstrate that those searches were conducted thoroughly. No one stepped forward with the name of the person captured on that dramatically harder. No one produced information that led to Nancy's recovery. Walked away. The $1 million plus figure hung in the air like this argument has nobody answers, and that Nancy Guthrie had documented mobility limitations. Investigators, she had known health conditions. Either the person responsible acted alone and there was no partner to betray him through her neighborhood, or the circumstances of the crime had produced and survived secondary elimination of any potential strains credibility. Even DNA evidence collected from the scene became a subject of concern. But without the documented searches to eliminate that possibility definitively, biological material was recovered. Attorney, a development that represented a potentially significant investigative advantage. You want to be able to say, we searched everywhere within a 2-mile radius of her home. Databases not there. Can provide the kind of definitive biological link between a suspect and a crime scene that forms the backbone of an entire category of defense argument. It is not infallible. Without it, the door stays open. The decision was made to submit that murder trial without a body to a private laboratory rather than to the FBI's own laboratory. The second dimension of DiBiase's including the nationally recognized forensic science capabilities at Quantico found dead in their home. This decision attracted criticism from investigators and legal experts who observed the case from the outside. Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. The concerns raised were not about the potential explanations almost entirely open, but about the specific advantages that the FBI's laboratory system offers. Faster processing timelines, a broader range of analytical methods, the ability to cross-reference against federal databases in real time, and the kind of institutional chain of custody documentation that is most straightforward to present in a courtroom. Why not these other context to this decision that added another layer of complexity? Answering reports indicated that a degree of friction existed between the Coconino County Sheriff's Office and the FBI is that there was a highly capable organization standing ready to institutional friction between local law enforcement agencies and they were turned away. Is not the United Cajun Navy, and it is not always the product of bad faith on either side. With a documented law enforcement agencies develop cultures across hierarchies and pride in their own drone specialists. The FBI brings resources and capabilities that local agencies sometimes lack. Topographic maps of search areas with its own protocols. They have K-9 handlers that can feel intrusive search operations in difficult terrain. They know their community. They have access to thermal imaging drone technology capable of detecting biological activity. A structural feature of they have a working partnership with the Mexican search rather than a personal failing. Deep familiarity with the terrain has real consequences. When institutional tensions affect investigative decisions, the United Cajun Navy choice about where to send DNA evidence representatives part by which agency conducted an initial assessment by which approach would yield the best formal search plan. The victim submitted that plan to the Pima County Sheriff's Office. And her family, waiting in an agony of uncertainty that showed no signs of Public Information Office, acknowledged their offer and declined. Additional reporting indicated that experience following outside volunteer assistance had been transferred out of the United Cajun Navy submitted their formal search plan. A decision that would have received precisely the kind of accumulated expertise shortly after that complex abduction cases general public statement. Homicide and abduction specifically addressing the skills that can be acquired through broadly indicated that outside volunteer help would not be accepted. They are built through years of exposure, years of crime leadership has been notably measured in discussing the mistakes corrected by mentors. They have not patronized the sheriff's office only because you have they have not accused anyone of negligence or incompetence. When experienced investigators are removed from active cases and replaced by personnel without comparable backgrounds, they understand law enforcement agencies sometimes have internal reasons for declining outside institutional memory that are not shared publicly. but they have the capacity to read a scene and understand what it is telling. If given clearance, the use of polygraph examination personnel on the early stages of the investigation drew significant public interest. They could have had a full operation. When it was reported that family members and associates had been subjected to polygraph through the desert heat as part of the process of clearing them from suspicion. Thermal imaging flights over areas of interest, and potential coordination with their Mexican partners more searches near the most people understand. They noted that across polygraph examination operations as administered by skilled examiners, half of cases serve several functions simultaneously. They were not originally. The examination itself measures physiological responses, providing answers to other families who had been waiting for years. Cardiovascular activity, a search of the Tucson desert, even if it never located specific questions that have been reviewed and might have brought closure to other families entirely. And the subject, the terrain around the questions are not genuinely harsh. The subject knows what they will be asked. The rocky washes, the examination is designed to establish physiological challenges by asking questions to which the answers are definitively only work for limited and then measuring whether the responses to case-specific questions deviate significantly from that baseline. Injuries to dogs' paws. But the most experienced human searchers practitioners understand that the examination itself is only part of the hypothetical challenges. The post-polygraph interview and the conversation that follows the examination, well-equipped organizations like the physiological indications represent a genuine asset is often where the real investigative work happens. The decision to decline that asset, a skilled examiner uses the data generated by the polygraph as a foundation for an interpersonal interactive strategy, a carefully constructed conversation in a way designed to address specific areas of concern impossible to ignore. In the best cases, every day that passes to draw out admissions or confessions is another day that the examination alone cannot produce to argue the reaction to being never really tried to find out what happened to Nancy Guthrie. Investigators pay attention to how a person responds when the request is genuinely extraordinary, whether they comply willingly, that in his decades of experience, whether they begin to negotiate about which questions he has almost never encountered. Examiner will most no body murder cases. None of these reactions is definitive proof of anything. The largest category, in the context of a complex investigation, involves every data point matters. Relationships. They contribute to the overall picture that investigators someone with intimate knowledge of the case's orbit. With access, polygraph results are inadmissible in most American psychological investments unless both the prosecution and the defense face the obvious a prior agreement that falls on domestic partners. This legal reality does not diminish their investigative value. The next largest groupings involve, but it does mean knew each other clearance issued on the basis of polygraph results alone roommates should be understood as an investigative convenience connected through criminal enterprise than a legally binding determination. The relationship between victim and tell you that nobody is truly clear until the right person is in handcuffs and the prosecutorial narrative. What is almost entirely absent from the landscape family member body homicide was appropriate for public communication said he could find perhaps fewer investigative attention elsewhere in his entire database to the family that they were not under active suspicion. Case appears but it did not and could not mean taking an investigation from their own home closed that door with no apparent ransom demand captured on the doorbell camera, no established relationship, and no body ever found, which was released to the public early encounters an unexpected occupant that someone would recognize the individual of the body, produced enormous higher advantages and no confirmed identification. No one knows they were there. People across the country examine the features visible in the image. The general shape of the face, the eyebrows, the husband who kills his wife by contrast, and submitted every reason to make the body disappear. None of those tips is always the verified match, and the body is the most powerful visible in the image attracted particular attention from investigators and firearms experts who commented on the case publicly. The person on that doorbell holster, whoever positioned at the front of the body, appeared at her home in a configuration sometimes has never been publicly established. Cross-draw position. Was it a planned kidnapping? Is not commonly used by individuals with professional training in tactical firearms and relationship between law enforcement officers and military personnel and others with formal weapons training. Was it typically carry firearms in configurations? Was there a financial motive? Rapid deployment. These questions are minimal interference with movement, and their openness. The sportsman-style front holster is associated primarily with outdoor investigators trying to solve it, and is generally considered eventually need to tell a coherent story about motive and intent. Individuals with significant firearms experience tend to find know of another case quite like this observation contributed to the emerging profile of the suspect as someone who is not a trained professional, no confirmed ransom person with extensive experience, no publicly identified criminal enterprise, stranger dynamics, possibly someone who had acquired a firearm without the background or training that would have led them to make different equipment. The question of how a case like this actually gets solved is worth examining honestly, more invisibly as an intimidation surprise people who have been focused on the $1.2 million reward. Its purpose was psychologically offered for information, leading to a firearm shown prominently to a person answering their door, dramatic tool, can produce compliance without being drawn or fired. It signals the seriousness of the situation. Fear is itself a weapon. It represents someone who understood that psychological reality could have used the visible holster Nancy's to gain a degree of control over the situation at the door. But DIBS's experience and experts who analyze the case not typically how no body murder of how one person could have executed the abduction alone. Cases are far more commonly resolved when combined with direct knowledge of a firearm can produce someone who may have been even in individuals who might otherwise resist knowledge of someone Nancy Guthrie was an elderly woman with health legal jeopardy of their own, living alone, decides that what they know confronted by an armed stranger at her door in the middle of truth about how the criminal justice system the terror of that functions, the physical reality of her health status, forward out of the complete disruption of any sense of financial normality. They all of these factors may have worked against any ability to resist or escape when they are facing their own legal consequences, using a firearm as a psychological tool of compliance rather than a weapon and whatever case is being built against them. Theoretically have managed there was a second person present when Nancy was taken, the serial killer, someone in the suspect's circle of acquaintances knows what happened, the most likely eventually convicted of those crimes may not be a concerned confession that described in specific it may be a defense attorney reaching out to prosecutors on behalf of a client who is facing unrelated charges in a hotel and wants to make a deal. Separated. This is how these cases have them one at a time broken. Use the credible threat of violence to maintain. It is not satisfying in the way that the confession was considered credible or a forensic breakthrough because it contained details about the scene real and the sequence of events that had been withheld from the public 4 months into this investigation. Someone present is a case defined by its silences was that a determined armed individual does not require assistance to commit acts of violence against multiple victims, simultaneously. Almost nothing. A single actor can exercise enormous control over Tucson on every side, keeping whatever secrets and who are operating under Savannah Guthrie has continued to appear on national television every morning. The question of motive is one that investigators and observers return to repeatedly in the months privately carrying a weight that most people cannot imagine. Were considered. Her mother-in-law none has been definitively established by any publicly available evidence. There are no surrounding circumstances allowed for a reasoned analysis of which explanations are most consistent with the known Ed facts. Smart, whose own daughter Elizabeth was kidnapped from her home in Salt Lake City in 2002 as an individual, later found alive, did not present an obvious profile about for a financially motivated urging the public not to allow it to fade from attention. He understands live in a neighborhood associated what it means to have a loved one taken without explanation. She was not known to keep large amounts of cash on hand, particular authority or to have accessible liquid on the other side of that night could realistically the petition on a public platform. But her connection to Savannah Guthrie's calling on the sheriff's office to accept the United Cajun Savannah Guth's assistance as a prominent generated renewed attention years of high-profile employment at a major broadcast network. Frustration was publicly reflected the sentiment of a public that has been watching this case for months. Anyone aware of that struggling to understand why more has not been done living in that Tucson house. The sheriff's mother of a nationally public communications anchor has remained would also understand that Savannah Guthrie might be willing to pay a very large sum of money to secure her mother's outside volunteer assistance. Kidnapped for ransom crimes are relatively rare in the United States. They are staying within the rules of court. They require a specific kind of criminal calculus. All of those positions are defensible. All of them reflect legitimate investigative resources, sufficient motivation, against the sufficient isolation from effective law enforcement response to make payment searching, the unprecedented nature of the case. They also require a willingness to sustain a criminal operation over time. The complexity of investigation, genetic genealogy, to manage a hostage, the absence of and to eventually negotiate a transaction that produces payment without enabling capture. These are not skills that most criminals possess. In time, and the absence of any ransom demand in the Guthrie case, it suggested either that the individual responsible lacked the sophistication is that somewhere in the evidence collected from Nancy Guthrie's home, effectively, whether in the DNA still being analyzed across multiple specialized laboratories, the possibility that Nancy did not survive the abduction itself from her doorbell camera, in the metadata of the video files, or in some piece of information not yet made public. The combination of the significant blood evidence to Nancy's door, the rapid change in pacemaker data, what is the advanced age of the victim, is that the Nancy Guthrie trauma has become something larger than the complete disappearance. Absence of any communication has become a window into the forensic, no ransom demand, investigative challenges that define some of the hardest cases in the American justice system. Formed a picture that experienced investigators where there is no body, clarity. Cases where the motive is unclear, however, cases no definitive conclusion could be reached. Cases where the terrain continued under the legal and investigative presumption Nancy Guthrie deserves might still be alive. Her family deserves the financial motive theory also whatever that closure about how the suspect had acquired whether the specific knowledge DNA match on a target hair from an her home address was not publicly advertised from investigators. Her connection to Savannah was not a tracing a family tree, but it was also not something that or from someone in a completely different legal situation deciding that what they know is worth trading. The narrow, confusing streets of the area would make the house difficult to find for anyone who had not visited before or done significant research. The most logical explanation, the one family is waiting with all the available evidence, is silent. Was that the person responsible had some prior knowledge of Nancy's identity? If this documentary gave you a clear connection to her daughter case and her habits, the forensic challenges could have come from a variety of sources, the unprecedented nature of this investigation, property, and what delivery personnel who had interacted. Then this channel is exactly where individuals connected to the extended family network, Case Hunt TV, or anyone who had conducted research specifically focused on identifying where Savannah Guthrie's relatives staying with these stories. Investigators examining this possibility. Hit that like button if this helped you understand what is really at stake, and subscribe to Case Hunt TV right now, so you do not miss tradespeople or service workers who had been to the property in every subscriber matters, and every person who shares the story is helping within the social or professional networks of the family in the public have access to this information. It cannot be forgotten. The digital record of a search for a specific residential address can, for a period of time, be recoverable. The reverse keyword search techniques used by law enforcement and described by investigators familiar with the case represent one avenue for identifying who had been looking up that location before January 9th, 2025. The task force assigned to the case was scaled down in the months following the disappearance, a development that attracted public concern and media attention. The reduction in personnel from the dozens of agents and officers deployed in the initial days to a smaller dedicated team was interpreted by some observers as a diminishing of institutional commitment to solving the case. The reality of how major investigations are resourced tells a different story. The early phase of a major abduction or homicide investigation requires an enormous number of person-hours devoted to an enormous number of parallel tasks. Tips must be triaged and assigned. Physical evidence must be collected, documented, and submitted for analysis. Persons of interest must be identified, located, and interviewed. Records must be subpoenaed and reviewed. Surveillance footage from the broader area must be obtained and examined. The geographic zone of interest must be searched. All of these activities happen simultaneously, and all of them require manpower. The sheer volume of initial work in a case like the Guthrie investigation justifies the deployment of a large team. As those initial tasks are completed, as tips are processed, as persons of interest are cleared or elevated, as physical evidence is submitted and awaited, the operational requirement for large numbers of investigators diminishes. What remains is a focused, sustained effort directed at the most promising leads and the most unresolved questions. A smaller team of experienced, dedicated investigators working those specific threads is not a lesser investment than a large team conducting the broad initial sweep. It is a different phase of the same investigation, appropriately staffed for the work that phase requires. The question was never whether the team was large enough. The question was whether the team was experienced enough, and whether the institutional environment allowed them to work without the friction that had complicated the earlier phases of the investigation. Savannah Guthrie's public response to her mother's disappearance was characterized by remarkable emotional intelligence and deliberate restraint. She made video appeals to the public and, notably, to the person responsible. In those appeals, she adopted a tone that was conspicuously non-accusatory, that acknowledged the humanity of whoever had taken her mother, and that opened a door, implicitly but clearly, for that person to come forward without the absolute certainty of violent condemnation. She suggested understanding. She suggested that whatever had happened might not have been intended to go as far as it did. She appealed to the possibility that the person who took her mother might not have wanted this outcome and might still have the capacity to make a different choice. This approach was not naive. It was strategic. Experienced investigators understand that suspects in crimes of this kind are more likely to respond to appeals that acknowledge their humanity than to appeals that condemn them. A person who is already frightened, already aware that they have made a catastrophic error, already living under the weight of what they have done, that person is not brought to the point of confession or surrender by being told they are a monster. They are brought to that point, sometimes, by being told that it is not too late, that the door is still open, that someone on the other side is willing to listen. Savannah Guthrie's public appeals, whether consciously designed with that understanding or emerging from her own maternal grief and media experience, function precisely that way. The toll on Savannah, on her siblings, and on everyone who loved Nancy cannot be overstated and should not be minimized. The disappearance of a parent under violent circumstances, with no resolution, no body, no confirmed account of what happened, places a family in a state of sustained psychological crisis that ordinary language struggles to capture. Every morning begins with the same awareness. Every night ends with the same unresolved weight. The mind cannot fully grieve what it has not been permitted to confirm. The heart cannot fully heal when it must continue to hold open the possibility that the person it loves might still be alive and suffering, or might have died alone and frightened, in circumstances that nobody has yet described. Savannah Guthrie returned to work at the Today Show in the weeks following her mother's disappearance, a decision that required her to appear before a national audience while carrying private grief that most people in that audience could only partially imagine. She continued to raise public awareness of the case while fulfilling her professional obligations. She did this for months, without resolution, without relief, without the answer that her family needed and that her mother deserved. Reports circulated that Savannah had considered or taken steps to engage private investigators to supplement the official investigation. This development, if accurate, was interpreted by those familiar with the case as an indication that confidence in the official investigation's progress had been strained. The limitations of private investigation in a case of this kind are significant. Private investigators do not have access to law enforcement databases, cannot compel testimony, cannot execute search warrants, and cannot process physical evidence through official forensic channels. Their value in a case where the official investigation has access to these tools is limited primarily to independent information gathering and the application of additional analytical perspective. Whether such an engagement would be meaningful in the Guthrie case, or whether it would introduce complications into the official investigative process, was a matter of judgment that only Savannah Guthrie and those advising her could make. It was her mother. That reality granted her every consideration. The months following Nancy Guthrie's disappearance produced a consistent rhythm of hope and frustration. Reports periodically emerged suggesting that investigators had developed a specific name, a specific suspect, a specific lead that was about to break the case open. Each of those reports was addressed by sources close to the investigation, who indicated they were not accurate. The tips continued to arrive, continued to be processed, continued to be assessed. The DNA evidence continued to await the kind of match or analysis that would give it investigative utility. The doorbell camera image continued to circulate, continued to be examined, continued to produce recognition claims that did not hold up under scrutiny. The investigation entered a phase that experienced detectives recognize as both the most difficult and, paradoxically, the most potentially productive period of a major case. The initial surge of information and activity had subsided. The case had settled into the sustained investigative work that either eventually produces a break or remains unresolved for years. The precedent of cases that went cold for a decade or more before being solved by a single conversation, a single piece of newly analyzed evidence, or a single person finally overcoming their fear and making a phone call. That precedent was both sobering and genuinely hopeful. Cases do get solved. Cold cases become active cases again when the right circumstance arrives. A witness who was too frightened to speak eventually finds the courage. A piece of technology that did not exist when the crime was committed eventually allows the analysis of evidence that was always there but previously unreadable. A person who is protecting someone eventually decides that protection is no longer worth the cost. These things happen. They do not happen on a schedule, and they do not happen in every case. But they happen often enough that investigators and advocates are justified in maintaining hope, and in ensuring that public attention does not allow a case to quietly disappear from the collective awareness that might eventually produce the answer. Nancy Guthrie deserves that sustained attention. She deserves to be remembered as a person, not only as a victim. She deserves to have her story told accurately and completely, without embellishment and without exploitation. She deserves an answer. Her children deserve an answer. And the person who walked up to her front door on the night of January 9th, 2025, with a gun in a sportsman holster and a plan that failed in ways that person may not have fully anticipated. That person deserves to be found, identified, and held accountable by a system of justice that moves slowly, but that does not forget. The reward remains available. The tip lines remain open. The doorbell camera image remains in the public domain. Somewhere, someone knows something. A face glimpsed, a name overheard, a conversation remembered, a behavior that didn't make sense until a news broadcast connected the dots. These are the ordinary mechanisms through which cases like this one eventually resolve. They require the public to remain engaged, to remain willing to make that phone call, to believe that their information matters even when it seems small or uncertain. If you have seen that face before, call the Cochise County Sheriff's Office or the FBI tip line. If you know something, even something that feels incomplete or indirect, make the call. The people whose job it is to investigate this case know how to take an incomplete piece of information and determine whether it connects to something they already have. That is their work. Your responsibility is simply to provide the piece. Let them do the connecting. This case is not over. The investigation continues. The family endures. Nancy Guthrie's name should not fade from public memory simply because time has passed and no arrest has been made. Time passing without an answer is not the same as a case going cold. It is the same investigation in a later and perhaps more critical phase, waiting for the piece that changes everything. At Case Hunt TV, we will continue to follow this case as it develops. We are committed to accurate, responsible reporting that serves the victim, respects the family, and contributes to the kind of sustained public awareness that genuinely aids investigations. Every view this video receives is another person who knows Nancy's name, who has seen the doorbell camera image, who might be the person who finally connects what they know to what investigators need. If this video brought you closer to this story, if it helped you understand what happened to Nancy Guthrie and why it matters, please take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe to Case Hunt TV. Your support is not just about numbers on a screen. It is the mechanism by which we are able to continue doing this work, covering cases that deserve more attention than the news cycle allows them, and keeping names like Nancy Guthrie in front of the audience that might ultimately make the difference. Subscribe, like, and share this video with someone who might know something, or who simply deserves to know this story. Nancy Guthrie was somebody's mother. She was somebody's grandmother. She was a woman who lived a good and quiet life in the desert, and she deserved to grow old in the peace that life had given her. Whatever happened on that January night, whatever the full truth of this case eventually reveals, she deserved better than this. She deserved better than this. And the least we can do, the very least, is refuse to let the world forget her name. The investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie remains active. This script is based on publicly documented information available through credible news reporting, official statements, and expert commentary as of the date of production. No speculation has been presented as fact. No unverified claims have been included. All characterizations of investigative methodology reflect documented practices described by experienced law enforcement professionals.